Losing your family does not always begin with a slammed door or shattered plates. For me, it happened under the glare of crystal chandeliers, when one casual sentence destroyed an illusion I had maintained for 30 years. My father looked around the lavish table, genuinely believing he was about to deliver the funniest joke of his retirement party. He never realized his own hands had just pulled the pin on a live grenade. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Nora Parker. The air inside the Annapolis Yacht Club smelled of aged bourbon, expensive sea salt, and the kind of untouchable wealth that insulated you from the harsh realities of the actual world. Tonight was the grand retirement gala for my father. After 35 years operating as a top-tier executive in weapons finance, he was finally stepping down. It felt as though half of the defense contractors, politicians, and corporate vultures in the state of Maryland had shown up to kiss his ring and pay their respects. I arrived exactly 45 minutes late. Punctuality at family events had never been my strong suit, mostly because I dreaded every second spent in their orbit. I walked through the towering mahogany double doors wearing a battered brown leather jacket, a plain gray cotton shirt, and a pair of simple charcoal slacks. As I stepped fully into the ballroom, the contrast was violently obvious. Around me, the room was a sea of shimmering silk evening gowns, custom-tailored Italian tuxedos, and diamond necklaces that aggressively caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. I was a dark, unpolished stain on a pristine white canvas, and I knew it. I just did not care. As I moved deeper into the room, fragments of conversations drifted past my ears. Men in expensive suits casually discussed the allocation of $50 million defense contracts as if they were trading baseball cards. Spouses dripping in pearls debated the merits of summer homes in the Hamptons versus private villas in Tuscany. This was a room completely insulated by its own arrogance, entirely detached from the blood and dirt of the real wars they profited from. I navigated through the crowd, ignoring the sideways glances and the subtle whispers of the elite guests. I spotted my family near the center of the room, holding court near a massive ice sculpture. My older brother Julian was standing right beside our father. Julian was a slick, high-powered political lobbyist in Washington. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that probably cost more than my entire annual rent. He possessed an effortless predatory charm that made him my father's absolute pride and joy. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, two sides of the same golden coin, laughing loudly at some inside joke. I approached their inner circle. My father saw me first. The booming laughter died in his eyes a full second before it left his lips. He gave me a brief, incredibly hollow nod. His gaze swept over my scuffed combat boots, traveled up my unpressed slacks, and lingered with intense distaste on the worn, frayed collar of my jacket. It was a look I had known my entire life. It was a silent, heavy judgment that firmly cemented my place in this family as the perennial disappointment. I was the failed child who had never quite measured up to the glorious Parker legacy of wealth and influence. "Nora," my father said, his voice entirely flat, "you actually made it." "Traffic on Interstate 95 was backed up," I replied evenly, keeping my face completely blank. A few of the VIP guests standing with them turned to look at me, their eyes scanning my outfit with thinly veiled confusion. One of them, an older man with thick silver hair and a gold watch that cost more than a suburban house, offered a polite but strained smile. "And what is it you do, Nora?" the older man asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Are you in the defense sector like your father and your brother?" Before I could even draw a breath to offer my carefully rehearsed cover story, my father smoothly intercepted the question. He chuckled, a dry, mocking sound that grated against my ears like sandpaper. "Oh no, Nora is just a civil servant," my father said, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "She works for a boring state administrative office down in Virginia. Basically, she spends her days teaching kids how to play flight simulator games. She has never seen a real battlefield handled a corporate ledger or made a real economic impact in her life. Someone has to keep the gaming chairs warm for the government, right? A few polite, awkward laughs rippled through the wealthy group. Julian smirked, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. "It is honest work, Dad." Julian chimed in, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "Not everyone is cut out for the real pressure of the industry." I looked at my father's smug face. I looked at my brother's arrogant smirk. I chose silence. I simply let the heavy insult hang in the air, washing over me like cold rain. I was so intimately accustomed to being belittled and minimized by them that the harsh words barely even left a phantom bruise anymore. There was absolutely no point in explaining myself. I could never tell these people the truth. I could never explain that my so-called boring administrative office was actually the National Strategic Defense Directive, commonly referred to as the NSDD. I could never tell them that my agency was a complete shadow organization, a phantom entity that did not exist on any official government paper, public tax record, or congressional budget. And I certainly could not tell them that the simulators I operated in the dark every single day were not games but the most lethal, highly classified orbital defense systems on the planet. Let them have their champagne. Let them have their jokes. I stood quietly in my worn leather jacket, completely invisible to the people who thought they owned the world, knowing exactly who actually held the keys to it. The transition from the cocktail reception to the grand dining service was a masterclass in excessive wealth. Waiters wearing immaculate white gloves moved in perfectly synchronized lines, delivering silver platters of seared scallops, butter, poached lobster, and dry-aged filet mignon. The main table, positioned like a royal court at the exact center of the ballroom, seated exactly 24 of the most influential figures in the state. I was relegated to the very far end of the long mahogany table, sandwiched awkwardly between a junior corporate executive who smelled heavily of imported cologne and an empty chair. Over the soft melodic notes of a live string quartet, the constant clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine bone china created a rhythmic, metallic hum. My father sat at the head of the table, holding court like a king. His face was deeply flushed from drinking 3 glasses of vintage Bordeaux and basking in his own unchecked ego. He dominated the conversation, launching into a series of highly exaggerated stories. He loudly recounted how he had single-handedly finalized a $400 million logistics contract back in 2012, conveniently omitting the army of exhausted analysts and lawyers who had actually drafted the paperwork. The wealthy guests nodded along, feeding his vanity with their rapt attention. Sitting exactly 4 seats away from me was a man who starkly contradicted the soft, pampered aesthetic of the room. His name was Marcus. He was a highly decorated former Navy SEAL, currently serving as the chief operations officer of an elite private security firm that held lucrative contracts with my father's conglomerate. While the politicians and businessmen around him possessed smooth hands and manicured fingernails, Marcus looked as though he had been chiseled out of hardened concrete. A thick, jagged pink scar tracked down from the edge of his left ear, cutting violently across his jawline before disappearing beneath the stiff collar of his crisp white shirt. He did not participate in the superficial chatter or the booming laughter. He sat perfectly still, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. He methodically swirled a glass of dark red wine, his eyes constantly tracking the movement of the serving staff. He possessed the hyper-vigilant, coiled posture of a predator forced to rest in a room full of oblivious herbivores. As the servers began clearing the main plates to prepare for the dessert course, the conversation at the table naturally began to slow down. My father, possessing an insatiable need to remain the center of attention, glanced down the length of the table. His eyes locked onto me. I saw the familiar cruel spark ignite within his gaze. The room was getting quiet, and he needed a quick, easy punchline to keep his audience thoroughly entertained. I was the most convenient target available. He tapped his heavy silver spoon lightly against the rim of his crystal champagne flute, a sharp ringing sound that immediately commanded the attention of the entire table. "You know, gentlemen, I suspect all this intense talk of tactical deployment and international defense contracts is probably boring my daughter," my father announced, his voice projecting clearly and confidently over the string quartet. "Nora here has her own fierce battles to fight every day. Tell me, Nora, since you have been a professional gamer for the government for the last 6 years, what exactly is your virtual character's name? You should probably tell your uncles here just in case they decide to log online tonight and need to avoid your deadly digital wrath." A chorus of polite, sycophantic laughter rippled around the table. Julian flashed a brilliant, mocking smile while bringing a glass of water to his lips. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not lower my eyes in shame. Instead, I slowly lifted my head and squared my shoulders. I met my father's amused, condescending gaze with absolute icy detachment. I did not shout, nor did I whisper. When I spoke, my voice was a low, resonant register that cut with surgical precision straight through the dying laughter of the wealthy elite. "Valkyrie Actual." The reaction was immediate and violently disruptive. A sharp, heavy clatter shattered the polite, refined atmosphere of the dinner service. Marcus's solid silver fork had slipped completely from his grip, dropping like a stone and striking his porcelain plate with enough force to crack the ceramic glaze. The sound echoed harshly. In an instant, the entire table fell absolutely painfully silent. The melodic notes of the string quartet in the background suddenly felt entirely too loud, out of place against the sudden suffocating vacuum of air around us. I shifted my gaze toward the former seal. The steady, untouchably composed demeanor Marcus had maintained all evening had simply vanished. The rugged, weather-beaten skin of his face had drained of all blood, leaving him looking as pale and lifeless as a fresh sheet of paper. His broad chest heaved. He twisted abruptly in his chair, his body going completely rigid, snapping his head around to face my end of the table. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto me with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. He stared wildly at my face. Then his gaze dropped frantically to my bare hands resting casually on the white tablecloth, tracking my fingers as if he expected them to conjure fire. The rhythmic, heavily controlled breathing of a highly trained special operative was gone, replaced instantly by rapid, shallow gasps. This was not the mild surprise of a man who had heard an unexpected joke. It was the visceral, raw, unfiltered panic of a soldier who had just been violently shoved backward into the darkest, bloodiest nightmare of his entire life. The atmospheric pressure in the grand ballroom seemed to plummet, drastically heavy and suffocating, like the terrifying stillness that precedes a massive, catastrophic storm. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The melodic, soothing background music provided by the string quartet faltered and died away entirely, the musicians sensing the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere. Even the highly trained serving staff froze in place, their white-gloved hands hovering rigidly over the silver dessert trays. Marcus did not look at my father. He did not look at Julian. He completely ignored the two most powerful, influential men at the table, as if they were nothing more than transparent ghosts. The heavy mahogany chair scraped harshly against the polished marble floor as Marcus abruptly stood up. He leaned heavily over the massive table, pressing both of his large, thickly scarred hands flat against the crisp white linen. The expensive crystal wine glasses situated near his knuckles trembled slightly under the sheer, uncontained physical pressure he was exerting. 33 degrees 9 minutes north, Marcus said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the vast space between us, yet it possessed enough raw gravity to anchor the entire ballroom. 40 degrees, 22 minutes east. The deep desert on the outskirts of the border. November 12th, 2018. A black site extraction gone completely to hell. I kept my eyes locked directly on his. I did not blink. I did not let a single muscle in my jaw tighten. Inside my mind, the phantom smell of scorched ozone and burning copper from my neural interface helmet immediately flared to life. I could almost feel the synthetic crushing gravity of the orbital drop sequence pressing against my chest. a memory permanently burned into my nervous system. But on the outside, sitting at the edge of that extravagant dinner party, I remained an impenetrable, flawless fortress of ice. "I asked you a specific question," Marcus demanded, his voice rising in volume, cracking violently with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly close to grief. "Were you the operator on that encrypted channel? Were you the one holding the sky open for my team?" The wealthy defense contractors, the seasoned politicians, and the corporate executives exchanged nervous, bewildered glances. These were men and women who treated global warfare like a lucrative spreadsheet. They were entirely unaccustomed to real, unfiltered military trauma bleeding out onto their fine china and imported centerpieces. "I cannot confirm or deny any specific operational coordinates, geographic locations, or past deployment dates," I replied. My tone was purely mechanical, stripped entirely of human warmth or hesitation. "All inquiries regarding the events of 4 years ago fall under strict Level 5 security protocols. That information is highly classified and compartmentalized." I did not nod. I did not offer a comforting smile. But I held his frantic gaze with a steady, knowing intensity. My cold, calculated silence was the loudest, most definitive answer I could possibly give him. He knew. And I knew that he knew. At the head of the table, my father's face transitioned rapidly from flushed, drunken amusement to an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. The spotlight had been abruptly, violently ripped away from him. His grand, humiliating joke had completely derailed. Worse still, his prized VIP guest, the hardened combat veteran he used to boost his own corporate image, was currently treating his estranged, disappointing daughter with a level of intense, desperate reverence that my father fundamentally could not comprehend. "Marcus, please, let us calm down for a second," my father interjected. He let out a loud, incredibly forced laugh that echoed awkwardly across the dead silent ballroom. He stood up quickly and reached across the back of the heavy chairs, attempting to reassert his dominance by placing a heavy, patronizing hand on the former operative's broad shoulder. "You have had a bit too much of the reserve wine, my friend. Do not let her play these silly little mind games with you. I promise you Nora has never been within 5,000 miles of a combat zone. She sits in a heavily air-conditioned basement in Virginia and clicks a plastic computer mouse." Before my father's fingers could even settle completely on the fabric of his expensive jacket, Marcus reacted. He moved with the blinding, instinctual speed of a cornered predator. He violently shoved my father's hand away, the force of the rejection causing the older man to stumble backward and crash heavily into the edge of his own grand armchair. Julian immediately jumped up from his seat. His fists clenched, but one furious, dead-eyed glare from Marcus froze my brother perfectly in his tracks. "Do not touch me!" Marcus snarled, his eyes never leaving mine. He did not even bother to look back at the man who was currently paying his security firm millions of dollars. When Marcus finally spoke to the rest of the room, his voice shook with a terrifying mixture of pure adrenaline and absolute conviction. "You people sit here in your custom suits, and you laugh at her." Marcus projected his voice, addressing the entire horrified table. "You think she plays video games? You think she is some low-level desk clerk who pushes papers? Let me tell you about her game. If it were not for that girl and her damn simulator, myself and 6 other men would be rotting beneath 60 feet of burning desert sand right now." A low collective murmur of confusion and dawning horror began to ripple through the sea of guests. The politicians and weapon developers in this room were not ignorant people. They knew the dark whispered rumors that floated through the most secure corridors of the Pentagon. They knew about the black budget projects that defied conventional physics and traditional warfare. The pieces were rapidly clicking into place in their calculating minds. They were looking at my plain clothes, my quiet demeanor, and then at my hands. The whispers began to circulate rapidly down the length of the table. They were finally putting together the concept of the National Strategic Defense Directive. They were beginning to realize that the simulators I sat in were directly linked to a clandestine network of low Earth orbit kinetic bombardment platforms. They were piecing together the terrifying truth that I did not just fly digital airplanes on a computer screen. I wore a neural simulation crown that connected my brainstem directly to a swarm of weaponized hypersonic drones circling the globe. They realized that the girl they had just spent the evening mocking was the operator who brought Hellfire down from the stratosphere commanding catastrophic lethal force with nothing more than a thought and a retinal flicker. The room that had been drowning in condescension just 5 minutes earlier was now suffocating under the crushing weight of an invisible, terrifying reality. Marcus did not sit back down. He remained leaning heavily against the table, his eyes burning with a chaotic mixture of reverence and lingering terror. When he began to speak again, his voice was no longer a shout. It was a low, steady recounting of a descent into pure hell, forcing every single person in that lavish ballroom to listen. "We were trapped in a blind box canyon," Marcus said, his voice grating like crushed stones. "There were over 200 hostile combatants closing in from the high ground. We had zero aerial support. A massive Category 5 sandstorm had rolled in, blinding every satellite and grounding every conventional aircraft within a 500-mile radius. Central Command at Bagram Airfield officially declared the airspace completely impenetrable. They told us to dig in and pray. They wrote us off as acceptable losses. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the sharp, uneven breathing of the millionaire sitting next to me. We ran out of ammunition after 4 hours. Marcus continued, his hands gripping the white tablecloth so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. 3 of my men were critically wounded. The enemy was less than 50 yards away, moving in for the slaughter. We knew exactly what they would do to us if they took us alive. Huddled in the dust, our vision entirely obscured by the whipping sand, we each yanked the pins from our last fragmentation grenades. We were prepared to finish things on our own terms. Marcus fell silent, his chest rising and falling heavily. He stared straight at my father, whose expression was locked in a stiff mask of sheer disbelief. And then the radio crackled to life. Marcus uttered, his tones sinking to a reverent hush. A secure, heavily encrypted channel cut straight through the static and the sand. It was a woman. She identified herself as Valkyrie Actual. She calmly told us to keep our heads down. Later, I found out from a classified debriefing that she had completely ignored a direct order to stand down from a 2-star general. She manually disabled the remote safety protocols on a prototype stealth platform. She pushed her neural link past the absolute redline, piloting that bomber entirely by hand, diving straight down into a storm that was tearing the sky apart. Marcus turned his gaze back to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She dropped a payload of precision kinetic strikes closer to our position than any computer would ever allow. Marcus finished, his voice breaking. She leveled the entire canyon perimeter. She saved our lives. Every single one of us walked out of that valley because of the woman you just called a joke. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The weight of his words settled over the opulent dining table like a suffocating blanket of lead. The politicians and executives stared at me with newfound terror, their eyes wide with the realization that I was not a paper pusher but a sanctioned executioner who had defied military high command. Then a violent, ugly sound shattered the silence. It was my father. He slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany table with enough force to topple his crystal wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the pristine white linen, looking exactly like fresh blood. His face had transformed from a pale mask of shock into an ugly, bloated portrait of pure rage. "This is absolutely absurd," my father roared, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "Marcus, you are intoxicated. You are making up a ridiculous drunken fairy tale. This is stolen valor. You are taking the heroic actions of some highly trained pilot and projecting them onto my daughter just to make a scene. Look at her. She is a failure. She could not even pass her freshman economics classes. She does not have the discipline to shine your boots, let alone pilot a billion-dollar aircraft." His toxic pride simply could not process the truth. He would rather completely destroy my character in front of the most powerful people in the state Then accept that the child he had spent 3 decades belittling was entirely superior to him in every conceivable way. Julian immediately jumped to his feet, adjusting his expensive tie with a nervous, frantic energy. He needed to protect the family brand. "Dad is right," Julian said, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "Nora, you have completely ruined this retirement dinner. You paid him to say this, did you not? You need to apologize to Dad right now, and then you need to leave before I have the security staff physically remove you." I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly pushed my heavy wooden chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the marble floor, and I stood up. I smoothed the front of my worn leather jacket, looking at my father and my brother as if they were nothing more than microscopic insects. 3 days, I said. My voice was perfectly flat, devoid of any anger or sadness. It was the absolute chilling calmness of a machine. There are exactly 3 defining days in my life. I took a slow step forward away from the table. The first day, I continued, was during my initial neural integration training. My brain rejected the interface. I suffered massive catastrophic seizures on a cold linoleum floor for 6 straight hours. I was bleeding from my nose, my ears, and my eyes. The medics had to restart my heart twice. When I finally woke up in the intensive care unit 3 days later, I checked my phone. I had 1 voicemail from you, Dad. You were furious because my absence meant you had to find a last-minute replacement for your charity golf tournament. My father opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The wealthy guests were staring at him in absolute disgust. The second day, I said, my tone remaining ruthlessly steady, was the day I lost my co-pilot. His neural pathways overloaded during a live combat drop over Eastern Europe. His brain simply melted while he was sitting right next to me in the pod. I held his hand while he died. 2 hours after I zipped him into a black body bag, you called me. You called to yell at me for missing the family Thanksgiving dinner, telling me that I was an embarrassment to the Parker name. Julian lowered his hand, his arrogant smirk completely wiped away, replaced by a sickening pale horror. And the third day, I concluded stopping just a few feet away from my father's chair, is today, right now. You just heard a decorated war hero tell you that I saved his life. You just learned that I hold more destructive power in my bare hands than your entire corporate empire could ever dream of buying. And your very first instinct, your only instinct, is to call me a liar because my success is a direct threat to your fragile, pathetic ego. I looked down at the man who had given me life. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The bond of blood had been entirely severed, burned away by the very same fire that had forged me into a weapon. I am not going to apologize, I said softly, the silence in the room magnifying every single syllable. And I am not going to leave. You are going to sit there, and you are going to choke on the reality that the daughter you threw away is the only reason you sleep safely in your expensive beds. My father inhaled sharply, his chest expanding with sudden violent fury. The veins in his neck bulged, pressing thickly against the stiff collar of his tailored shirt. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly toward the massive exit doors at the far end of the ballroom. He drew in a massive breath, his face turning a dark, ugly shade of purple, fully prepared to scream at the top of his lungs and banish me from his pristine, wealthy kingdom forever. He never got the chance to speak the words. Before the first syllable could even leave his lips, the power grid of the entire Annapolis Yacht Club suffered a catastrophic total failure. It was not a simple flicker. It was an instant violent plunge into absolute suffocating darkness. The hundreds of glowing bulbs in the massive crystal chandeliers above us died in perfect unison, cutting off all light in the blink of an eye. A fraction of a second later, the deafening, bone-rattling shriek of the emergency security alarms tore through the pitch-black room, a high-pitched wail that physically vibrated in my teeth. Pure, unfiltered chaos erupted. The wealthy elites who had spent their entire lives completely insulated from actual physical danger immediately lost their minds. Women wearing expensive silk evening gowns screamed in sheer, unadulterated terror. men in custom-tailored tuxedos shoved each other blindly scrambling like frightened rats to hide beneath the heavy mahogany tables. The sharp, chaotic sounds of shattering crystal wine glasses and snapping porcelain plates filled the air as the extravagant banquet was blindly trampled in the dark. Then the towering oak doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They were violently breached. The heavy wood splintered and smashed inward with the deafening force of a localized explosion. A dozen blinding white tactical flashlights pierced the thick darkness, cutting through the swirling dust and the panicked crowd like solid laser beams. A heavily armed elite tactical strike team flooded into the ballroom. They moved with terrifying fluid precision. They wore pitch-black combat gear with absolutely no identifying patches, no unit insignias, and no names on their vests. They carried suppressed submachine guns sweeping the massive room in tight, highly calculated arcs. Within 15 seconds, they had physically barricaded every single exit and locked down a room containing the most powerful politicians and billionaires in the state of Maryland. A wealthy defense contractor sitting near the front foolishly tried to stand up, waving his hands frantically and shouting aggressively about his legal rights. One of the operators did not even blink, simply shoving the furious millionaire back down to the hard marble floor with a brutal crushing strike from the heavy stock of his rifle. The room immediately fell into a terrified, whimpering hush, completely drowned out by the still shrieking security siren. Through the impenetrable wall of armed soldiers walked a single man. He was not wearing heavy tactical gear. He wore a sharp, impeccably tailored dark gray suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his face was carved from pure, unyielding granite. He was the director of the National Strategic Defense Directive. He was the phantom who whispered directly into the ear of the president, a man who possessed more raw, unchecked authority than the entire United States Congress combined. The director did not look at the whimpering billionaires. He completely ignored the powerful politicians cowering on the cold floor. He parted the sea of terrified elites with purposeful, heavy strides, walking directly toward the head of the main dining table where I stood. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. He did not offer a polite greeting, nor did he offer a military salute. There was absolutely no time for pleasant formalities. The air around him practically vibrated with a lethal, terrifying urgency. He slammed a sleek, matte black digital briefcase directly onto the center of the table. The heavy metal case completely crushed the remains of my father's expensive dessert plate, sending silver forks and broken ceramic shards clattering loudly across the polished wood. With a rapid practiced twist of his wrist, the director engaged the complex biometric locks. The briefcase snapped open. A blinding blood-red holographic display immediately projected upward, bathing my face and the surrounding darkness in a harsh crimson glow. 3-dimensional maps of the globe, rapidly scrolling lines of encrypted source code, and terrifyingly fast countdown timers floated directly above the crushed lobster shells and the spilled red wine. "We have a massive global breach," the director said. His voice was a calm, chilling baritone that cut perfectly through the wailing security alarms. Exactly 15 minutes ago, a highly coordinated cyber attack originated from a subterranean bunker in Eastern Europe. They completely bypassed the outer firewall of the orbital network. They have successfully hijacked the targeting telemetry for 4 of our low-orbit kinetic bombardment satellites. I stared intently at the floating red data streams. My heart rate instantly plummeted, my years of brutal training taking over. The lingering anger from the toxic family drama evaporated, completely replaced entirely by cold mechanical focus. "What is the targeted blast radius?" I asked, my voice completely stripped of human emotion. "They are aligning the tungsten rods to drop directly onto 3 major population centers across the Allied eastern seaboard," the director replied. His dark eyes locked firmly onto mine. "We are calculating millions of immediate casualties if those kinetic rods hit the atmosphere." The Pentagon tried to initiate the remote kill switches, but the hackers permanently severed the ground links to the main servers. The entire global defense grid is completely locked out. Why are you here? I demanded, my hands hovering just inches over the holographic keyboard. Why bring the emergency interface directly to me instead of extracting me to the Virginia bunker? Because we simply do not have the time, the director stated flatly, pointing a finger at the glowing red numbers rapidly counting backward in the air. The orbital platforms will reach the optimal firing coordinates in exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds. You are the only active operator who possesses the level Omega neural biometrics. Only your specific brainwaves, your exact retinal signature, and your unique command codes can forcefully override the satellite hardware from a remote unlinked relay. The United States government needs you to manually break their digital hold and redirect those catastrophic weapons right here, right now, directly on this dinner table. The red light from the glowing hologram illuminated the faces of the people surrounding us. I slowly glanced to my left. My father was pressed completely flat against the high back of his luxurious wooden armchair. His face was entirely devoid of all color, his skin turning a sickening translucent shade of gray. His mouth hung open in silent, breathless horror, his manicured hands shaking violently against the armrests. The man who had spent 30 years ruthlessly cultivating corporate power, the man who had mocked me mercilessly just 10 minutes earlier, was now utterly paralyzed. He was forced to sit in the dark and watch his entire worldview shatter into a million irreparable pieces. He was watching the daughter he had cruelly labeled a massive failure, the daughter he had treated like a pathetic joke, suddenly become the single most important human being on the entire planet. He was watching the most terrifying, powerful men in Washington bypass his wealth, entirely treating his despised child with absolute, unquestioning obedience. The illusion of his supremacy was completely dead. I placed my hands firmly over the holographic interface. The harsh crimson light from the digital display washed over my face, yet I felt absolutely nothing. There was no fear, no panic, and absolutely no hesitation. The red countdown timer hovering in the air read exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds. My fingers immediately flew across the virtual keyboard. I began inputting a series of highly complex alphanumeric override codes faster than the human eye could accurately track. I systematically broke through the hostile digital barricades, severed the enemy connection to the global satellite network, and manually seized control of the targeting telemetry. The air in the room was suffocatingly still. The only sound was the frantic synthetic hum of the briefcase processing my commands. With exactly 12 seconds left on the countdown clock, I successfully gained full administrative access. I forcefully redirected the catastrophic payloads, dumping the massive kinetic energy harmlessly into the deepest, most isolated trench of the North Atlantic Ocean. The flashing red warning lights on the holographic map instantly shifted to a calm, stable blue. I had just saved tens of thousands of lives in exactly 3 minutes and 28 seconds of total absolute silence. The director of the NSDD let out a long, heavy breath, the tension finally leaving his rigid shoulders. He reached up and tapped the side of his secure earpiece. "Secure the entire perimeter," the director ordered quietly, his voice echoing in the dark room. "Bring the stealth transport down to the East Lawn. We are extracting Valkyrie Actual to the primary underground command center immediately." He snapped the digital briefcase shut. The sudden loss of the holographic glow plunged us back into total darkness for a brief second before the emergency backup generators of the yacht club finally roared to life. The ruined glass-covered ballroom was suddenly flooded with a dim, flickering yellow light. The return of the light completely broke the spell that had paralyzed my father. He slowly pushed himself up from his heavy wooden chair. The arrogant, untouchable corporate executive was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified, and utterly defeated old man. His expensive tailored suit was rumpled, his face was drained of all color, and his hands shook violently as he took a hesitant, stumbling step toward me. He reached out with trembling fingers, desperately wanting to grab my arm, wanting to physically cling to some familiar, controllable piece of the daughter he thought he knew. I took one deliberate, measured step backward. I did not flinch, but I refused to let him touch me. My father dropped his hand to his side, his eyes wide and pleading. "Nora," he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute disbelief and a desperate need for understanding. "Who are you? What exactly are you?" I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel completely worthless. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or resentment. I simply smiled a cold, empty expression that conveyed absolute finality. "I am just a civil servant," I replied, my voice steady and entirely detached. "I spend my days teaching kids how to play flight simulator games." "Did you already forget?" I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on my father, my brother, and the ruined remains of the extravagant retirement party. I walked confidently toward the shattered oak doors, completely flanked by the heavily armed tactical strike team. As I passed the length of the dining table, Marcus immediately snapped to attention. The hardened, heavily scarred Navy SEAL stood perfectly straight, his face completely rigid with respect, and he delivered a sharp, flawless military salute as I walked past him into the night. 7 months later, the world kept turning. I sat alone in my heavily fortified underground bunker in Virginia, staring blankly at the vast, glowing map of the global defense grid. My personal cell phone buzzed softly on the metal console. It was another voicemail from my father. Over the past few months, his messages had transformed from angry, demanding rants into pathetic, choked-up apologies. He begged for my forgiveness. He pleaded for a single chance to finally be a real family. I listened to the pathetic sound of his weeping voice filling the quiet, secure room. I did not shed a single tear. I felt absolutely no anger and possessed absolutely no desire to reconnect. I simply reached out and firmly pressed the delete button on the screen. I picked up my heavy neural interface helmet, secured it firmly over my head, and went right back to controlling the sky. The most perfect, devastating revenge is not violently destroying your enemies. It is simply walking away, leaving them far behind, and forcing them to live the rest of their pathetic lives, drowning in absolute, inescapable regret. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.